Thank you for inviting me to come and speak for the Lyme Regis Fossil Festival this year. And obviously it's not the Fossil Festival as I know it and as we know it, because we are in this virtual world. So as John said, I'm going to be talking about my experiences working particularly with earthquakes, starting from the Jurassic Coast, because that's really where my story starts, to all around the world. And I'm currently based at the University of Plymouth as a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow and a lecturer in Earth Sciences. But my story really does begin on the Jurassic Coast. So I grew up on the Jurassic Coast, just inland from Lyme Regis. And since going to university and studying geology, and then I did a PhD in geology, and now I lecture in geology, my job so far has taken me to pretty much all over the world. So all of these stars on this world map shows the areas that I have either visited or worked in as a result of my job, studying earthquakes. And I'm particularly going to talk about two areas today, so Japan and Italy. And these are two areas I've worked in fairly extensively to better understand the earthquakes that happen in these regions. But as I said, we're going to start on the Jurassic Coast because that is where I'm from. This is me, a photograph of me, aged 9, at the Upline Village Fete. So if you're local, you might recognize the place. But this is me dressed up as Mary Anning with my younger brother, who very kindly agreed to dress up as Joseph Anning with me, although he doesn't look particularly happy at that, being made to do that. And it was growing up on the Jurassic Coast that really inspired me to study geology. Even if when I was kind of at primary school and secondary school, I didn't necessarily know what geology was. It was only really when I went to university and learned more about the subject in itself, learning more about what my hometown was and why it was so important to geology. And as I said, I went to university to study geology, and I did my undergraduate degree at Cambridge. And as part of this, I got to go on lots of field trips, which are a fantastic way of learning about learning geology. So I went to Arran, I went to Spain, I went to Greece. These are just a few of the places that we visited. And Greece was particularly interesting for me because this was the first time that I had visited somewhere that was affected by earthquakes. And actually this photograph is taken very close to an active fault line, and an earthquake on that fault line had destroyed a civilization, and we were visiting those ruins. And that's really what sparked my kind of interest in understanding earthquakes and wanting to understand the processes that go on to create earthquakes, because ultimately they have a huge effect on people that live in those areas. My first experience of actually working in an area after an earthquake was in 2016, which was after the Kumamoto earthquake, which happened in Japan. So this was while I was studying for my PhD, but I was on a brief visit to Japan. I was there for about 4 months in total, and this earthquake happened while I was there. And the professor that I was visiting invited me to go and help with some of the post-earthquake surveys in the region. And these two photographs show two of the kind of most common building types in the area and how they were damaged. So you've got up here in the right-hand side, you've got a very old traditional style building with a very heavy tiled roof and wooden walls. And you can see that the walls have just collapsed really under the weight of the roof. And then over here on the left, this is a more modern style of building. But what you can see with this one is that the first story has just sort of been pushed over, but the second story is almost intact. But I was primarily there as a geologist, so I was wanting to look for geological evidence of the earthquake rather than specifically looking at the building damage. And this is the evidence that we saw of the earthquake. So this is me standing here in the pink, and if I was doing this talk in person, I could say that I'm a perfect scale, but I'm about 1.6 meters tall. So that gives you an idea of scale. And what you can see is that I'm standing on a road, and there is a yellow line, and that yellow line has been offset from each other. It's moved. They're no longer perfectly lined up. You've also got over here on the right, this van. And if you look underneath the van, you can see that the ground has actually moved. So one side of the picture has gone up, the other side has gone down. And that van would have actually been parked there when that ground moved. It wasn't kind of carefully placed there after the event. So the first question often when I start talking about earthquakes that I often get from people is, what actually causes an earthquake? Because earthquakes are something that happen, you know, a long way. They start a long way under the ground. They're not something like a volcano, which is a very obvious feature in a landscape. Now, if this earthquake in Japan was one that happened several thousand, a few thousand years ago, and we'd gone to ask the Japanese a couple of thousand years ago what caused this earthquake, well, they would have said that it's caused by Onamazu, which was the name for a giant catfish in Japanese mythology that was thought to live underneath the islands of Japan. And the idea was that the catfish could only sit still for a certain length of time, because it's a fish and fish have to wriggle. And whenever the catfish would have a bit of a wriggle, that would be what causes an earthquake. Nowadays, we know that it's not catfish that cause earthquakes. It's actually faults, which are lines of geological weakness within the rocks or within the crust. And you may think that we don't really have earthquakes in the UK very much, so we can't really see any evidence for this in the UK. But you would be wrong. And we actually have some evidence for faults on the Jurassic Coast itself. So we're going to start looking at this very close to home. Metaphorical home of the Lyme Regis Fossil Festival, at least, you know. So if we go to Budleigh Salterton, we can look in the cliffs there, and which is what's shown on the left-hand side here. And if you look at this cliff, you might take one glance at it and think, oh, well, it's just red rocks. But if you look at it a little bit more closely, you can see that there are different layers within it. And there are different, we can pick out those different layers by looking at the different patterns in this photograph. So you can see that there's one sort of layer about here, and below that layer, it's quite rough and pebbly. Whereas above that white line, it's changed a little bit. So it's more, there's a slightly different style of erosion. And we can also see that the higher up we go in the cliff, it then changes from this kind of blobby style of erosion to much sort of flatter layers we can see in the cliff. Okay, so that's one half of a photo that I'm going to show you. I'm now going to show you the other half of a photo. And again, we can see the same kind of pattern. So we've got this very kind of rough, pebbly layer at the bottom of the cliff. This layer in the middle here, which is kind of got a blobby style of blobby erosion. And then another layer at the top that's much kind of flatter. We can see some layers within it. So now if I put this whole picture together, you can see that we've got the same sequence of rocks being repeated, the rough rocks, the sort of blobby eroded rocks, the flat layered rocks on either side of this photo. But we can't trace these lines all the way across the photo because they're offsets from each other. So the white line over here is higher than the white line over here. They've been offset. And if you're getting your eye in, you might spot that there is a line that comes down here through the cliff. And this is a fault. This is fundamentally what a fault is it's a break in the rocks that causes the rocks to be offset from each other. And it's that act of breaking the rock that's what generates earthquakes. Now, this is now an inactive fault. So this one is not going to cause earthquakes in the present day. But if we go back millions, hundreds of millions of years, this would have been an active fault and would have generated earthquakes. Maybe not the ones as big as the one that I showed you from Japan, but they might have been earthquakes that we could have felt if we were living here millions and millions of years ago. And it's not just that fault is just going to break once to generate an earthquake. There's a whole cycle that goes on, and it's to do with how the rocks respond to being put under stress. So let's say if we take this block of this sort of imaginary block of rock, which is what's shown in this picture here, and we're going to put some stress on it, which is shown by the blue arrows. And our fault, so that break in the rock, is going to come down the middle of this section. So at this time, the fault is locked, and as we put stress on it, the rock, the sort of the square is going to deform. So we're going to get strain being accumulated. And over time, that the strain is going to build up and the deformation is going to continue. So you can see that red layer that's being kind of stretched and offset from each other, but it's still very much joined together across the fault. But eventually, at some point, the rock is going to be unable to maintain and hold on to that stress and that strain. And so that fault is going to slip. And you can see now in this picture that those red boxes, that red layer, is offset from each other. And that's just like what we saw in the cliffs at Budleigh Salterton. And all that strain energy that had been built up across the fault is going to be released as seismic waves, and it's seismic waves that actually do the damage. That's what causes buildings to be damaged. So really, earthquakes are a way of changing different states of energy, and you can actually do a simple experiment to kind of show this for yourself. So if you take your hands and put your hands together and then rub them really, really quickly past each other, you should feel that your hands start to get really warm, and they also start to make a noise. And that's because you're putting in kinetic energy into moving your hands past each other. You're also having to overcome a little bit of friction between your hands as well. And that energy is getting transformed into heat energy. So that's why your hands get warm, and sound energy. That's why you can hear it. And earthquakes are just the same. It's changing a potential energy. So I'm putting force into my hands and energy into my hands to try and move them, which then changes into, in the case of earthquakes, seismic waves, and also a little bit of thermal energy as well. But it's the seismic waves that we notice the most. And this is called elastic rebound theory. And what elastic rebound theory also then predicts is it then implies that earthquakes, so if we could measure how strong the fault is and how fast the stress is being put onto the fault, if elastic rebound theory is totally correct, what that means is that we should be able to predict earthquakes. So to put it in slightly different terms, we've got two little graphs here. So one showing stress against time, and one showing the slip or the amount of movement against time. So if elastic rebound theory is perfectly correct, then we should have earthquakes that are the same size happen at regular intervals. There are a couple of different options that we could have for earthquakes. So instead, it could be that maybe the system is a little bit more complicated. So maybe rather than earthquakes always being the same size at the same time, maybe they're either the same size or they happen at regular intervals. Or the fourth option is that earthquakes could all be different sizes and they could happen at different times. And this would be, so over here on the left, so option A is that earthquakes are perfectly predictable, whereas option D is earthquakes are very unpredictable. So I'm interested to know what you think. So John, if you could activate the poll, please. So you should see a poll come up with the options A, B, C, D. So which ones of these do you think is most accurate for real life earthquakes? Do you think either we can perfectly predict them, which would be A, we can predict them some of the time, which would be B or C, or we can't predict them at all, which would be D? What do you think is the answer? Or what do you think is reality, I guess? Okay, I'm going to give you another 15 seconds or so to think about that. I can see a few of you have voted already. So which do you think it is? Are earthquakes completely predictable, which is A, a little bit predictable, which is B or C, or totally unpredictable, which is D? So I'm going to end the poll there. So I'm actually really pleased because nobody picked A, which is good because, yeah, earthquakes are not predictable at all. That the elastic rebound theory that I talked to you about it's very, very simple. Unfortunately, nature is just never that simple. So most of you said that it was either C or D. So actually, so what we think is that probably D is the most likely, and that's from observing earthquakes that happen all over the world. That sometimes we think that sometimes earthquakes might happen, lots of earthquakes at the same time, which we sometimes call a cluster, and then it might be a very long time period before the next cluster of earthquakes happen. But as to when that cluster is going to happen, or when the next earthquake is going to happen, we don't know, and currently we cannot predict earthquakes. And because we can't predict earthquakes, unfortunately, that means that we frequently see in the news about damaging earthquakes that happen around the world. And these were some headlines from various different news websites in 2016 following an earthquake in central Italy. Now, central Italy is where I do a lot of my research, and this earthquake was happened actually during my PhD when I was working in the area itself. So I wasn't there when the earthquake happened, but I was studying the faults in the area itself. And I went there in this earthquake happened. There was one earthquake that happened in late August, and then another one that happened in late October. And I went to the area in early October to survey some of the damage from that first earthquake in August. And this is some of the these are some of the villages that I visited. So this is a small town called Pescara del Tronto, in which pretty much every building was uninhabitable. And this is a it's a small village, very aging population, and it'll be very interesting and maybe sad to see how much of this village kind of comes back to life in the coming years, because there's a major cleanup operation that's still ongoing, even though this earthquake was 5 years ago. And this is the town of Amatrice, which was the main town or the main city that was damaged by the earthquake. And you may recognize the name if you read in any of the news articles around that time. And so this was the main street itself. And this was taken about a month after the earthquake happened. So actually they had managed to clear it. So you could get sort of recovery vehicles in, but very much the rubble was just kind of left strewn around. And this bottom picture shows the most typical way that these buildings in Italy fail is that we call it pancaking, and essentially the roofs and the floors are very strong and the walls are quite weak. So the walls collapse, and then the roofs and the floors fall down during the earthquake shaking. But I was there as a geologist, so I was specifically more interested in what had the earthquake done to the landscape itself. So just to give you a brief overview, so this is central Italy. So Rome is down here, and we have Florence is up here in the north, but it's really this central, very mountainous region, which is the area that I work. And all of the red lines on this image are active faults. So each one of these, the red lines, is a break in the rocks that is capable of generating an earthquake. And the town of Amatrice is here. And you may have also heard of the city of L'Aquila, which was badly damaged in an earthquake in 2009. And across Italy, Italy is getting wider at about 3 millimeters per year. And it's that extension, that pulling apart, that is what is providing that stress and that strain to actually cause these earthquakes. So we're going to focus in, I'm going to focus in and show you a little bit more about the Amatrice earthquake. So this is the town here, and this is the epicenter of the earthquake that happened in late August. And you can see that the red lines, those are the active faults marked on the map. So in 2016, we had 2 faults that moved. So this one moved and this one moved. So remember, the town of Amatrice is here. And then the town of Pescara del Tonto that I also showed you is just up here, right in between the 2 faults. And I'm now going to show you a photograph of what these faults look like, the movement on these faults actually look like. So this was taken in July 2017, so nearly a year after those 2 earthquakes that happened in August and October. And you can see in this image that there is a bright white stripe at the bottom of this cliff. And that's because the background of the photo has gone up and the foreground of the photo has come down. And zooming in a bit more closely is another photo of me for scale. This white surface is the amount of rock that came out of the ground during those 2 earthquakes in August and in September. So that's nearly 1.6 meters has come out of the ground during those earthquakes. And that's the actual geological evidence for this earthquake. And in Italy, we can see the faults that generate these earthquakes really, really clearly. And that's because of how the erosion rate has changed. So during the last glacial maximum, while there weren't glaciers in Italy, there were it would have been very, very high erosion rates. And so because the erosion rate was high compared to the throw rate, we would have none of these fault scarps generated. So every time there was an earthquake that generated an offset, it would have been eroded away and wouldn't have had a chance to kind of build up. But since the last glacial maximum, the erosion rate is now much, much lower. And so we get these scarps or these faults at the surface being formed. And we can see these very clearly in the landscape if you know what you're looking for. So this is a small town called Roccapetura, and you can see that there is a change in the hillside. You've got lots of rocks on one side, and then it goes to kind of green fields on the other. And this is the fault. So the right-hand side of this picture is going up, and the left-hand side is going down. So this is just like that block diagram I just showed you, but like flipped the other way around. And I say it's really easy for you to read these in the landscape if you know what you're looking for. Because if you don't, I'm going to zoom in on this area here. If you don't know what you're looking for, you might end up building your house against the fault plane. So this grey surface here, this is the fault plane, which is made of limestone. And somebody at some point had clearly decided to build their house directly onto this fault plane. And I think it's really interesting to wonder about what that person would have thought. What was their kind of logic behind building directly onto an active fault plane? Did they even recognize that it was an active fault plane? Probably not. But these fault scarps, these are really beautiful flat limestone features in the landscape. Now, once you know what you're looking for, they're really easy to find. But they're more than just pretty. They're more than just geologically beautiful. They can tell us some really useful things. And what they can tell us is how fast these faults are moving. So what we can do is we can look at how much offset there is across a fault, because what we assume is that the slope above and the slope below would have been joined together at some point, but they have been offset over time and over repeated earthquakes. And so I can tell you that, and we can use this to calculate the throw on the fault, which is basically, excuse me, the amount of vertical movement. Now, for this photograph, I can tell you that this person is about 2 meters high. And so the throw on this fault is about 5 meters. Okay, so, but if we want to calculate a rate, we need some kind of time measure. And for that, we need to date the end of the last glacial maximum, because I said, do you remember I said that these scarps have formed since the end of the last glacial maximum? How do we do that? Well, we look at pollen data, which is what this map, what this diagram shows. And what we can see is that at a certain point in time, which is shown by the red dashed line, there are fewer evergreen trees that are around after this red dashed line, which is about 15,000 years. And at the same time, we see a lot more deciduous trees. So these are the pollen from evergreen or deciduous trees in central Italy. And so what we can take from that is that it must have moved from a colder climate before 15,000 years, where there were lots more evergreen trees, to a warmer climate after 15,000 years, where we see these deciduous trees. So we get that the end of the last glacial maximum is about 15,000 years in this area. And so what we can do is we can take the throw that we measured, we take the slope, the ages of those slopes, and so we can calculate a throw rate of 0.3 millimeters per year. And you might think that that's really slow. And in comparison to some faults around the world, it is pretty slow. But why that's useful? Because the throw rate is a proxy for the seismic hazard. The bigger the throw rate, the more likely there is to be an earthquake, and the bigger the seismic hazard is going to be. The other thing, and we know that earthquakes happen pretty regularly in the Central Apennines. And the reason for that is that we have a really good record of historical seismicity. We actually have one of the longest historical records for anywhere in the world, really. And we believe, we think we know about all the earthquakes, all the damaging earthquakes since 1349. So it's nearly 700 years of records. And those records actually come in the form of written records kept by various monasteries throughout the region. So over here on the right-hand side, this picture shows lots of little triangles of different colors. So each one of these triangles represents a town, and the color represents the amount of damage. And this damage has been worked out from written records in monasteries, which would say things like, on the 14th of January, 1703, this town was entirely destroyed by an earthquake, or this town's church steeple fell off due to an earthquake, or people felt an earthquake and were very scared, but there was no damage to the buildings. And by going through and very carefully reading these records and working out the amount of damage from the written record, you can make a map like this, where the blues and the purples are the towns that were completely destroyed, and the yellows and the oranges are where the earthquake was felt, or there was maybe a small amount of damage, but it wasn't too bad. And so what we can do is we can then look at this and work out where are the faults that moved in this earthquake. And that's these ones here, which are shown by the red lines. So this is the 1915 Ficino earthquake, which was the biggest earthquake on record that happened in central Italy. And it left 33,000 people dead and this was in the middle of winter. So a lot of people also homeless in this very mountainous region. And actually from this event, we do also have photographs. So this is a photograph, very low quality, I'm afraid, given the time. But you can see that the ground has been offset. There's a break in the ground across this farmer's field. Okay, so what can we do with this information? So in Italy, we know where the faults are, and we know where were other earthquakes in the past. Well, we can use, I can use a technique called Coulomb Stress to try and understand how the stress and the strain has changed during earthquakes. So this is the only equation in my talk. I know it's very early on a Saturday morning for some maths, but I'm going to break it down for you. So what we have, so the Coulomb stress is a measure of how does the stress change around a fault after an earthquake's happened. And it's a combination of the shear stress, normal stress, and the coefficient of friction. So if we go back to our hands as an analogy for a moment, The shear stress is the stress trying to push your hands past each other. So it's making this kind of motion with your hands. The normal stress is the amount of stress that's put on your hands kind of into your hands themselves. So for example, when my arms are like this, I'm not putting much normal stress into my hands. Whereas if I change my arms to like this, I can feel that there's more force pushing my hands together. So that's the normal stress. And then the coefficient of friction is a measure of how easy it is to rub your hands past each other. So if you've got very, very rough hands, your hands would have a high coefficient of friction. If you've got very smooth hands, they would have a very low coefficient of friction. And it's those three components that make up the Coulomb stress. That's it for equations, because now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it into pictures. So I talked about how when a unit of rock deforms, it builds up stress and strain, and then when an earthquake happens, it releases that stress and strain. That wasn't entirely correct, because earthquakes don't just release stress. It's more like redistributing the stress. And so when an earthquake does happen, the stress decreases in some areas of the crust, and that's what's shown by the blue areas on this diagram on the right. And in some areas, the stress increases, which is what's shown by the red over here. So the key thing to remember is that red areas are where the stress has increased, and there is a potential for more earthquakes to actually happen. And so what this means is that let's take our very simple elastic rebound theory, which, remember, we've already said was wrong, but let's go back to basics for this. So if we have earthquakes happened at regular intervals on a particular fault, but it might be that there's another fault nearby that's also having earthquakes, or if this fault we're interested in has an increase in stress, then that's going to make earthquake 1 and earthquake 3 happen a little bit earlier than planned. Whereas if there's negative Coulomb stress transferred to the fault we're interested in, that's meaning that earthquake 2 is going to be delayed. So the stress is going to build up, but then it's going to be reduced and then build up again, be reduced, and so on. So actually, it's really useful to try and understand and try and calculate this Coulomb stress, because that can tell us whether earthquakes might happen earlier or later than we might expect. And we can see the best example of this is from the North Anatolian Fault in Turkey. So this is a big strike slip fault. That's where two plates are moving past each other like this. And from 1939 to 1992, there was a series of earthquakes that happened along this fault, where in 1939, it started at the very eastern end of the fault. And in every earthquake, every earthquake moved progressively west along the fault until in 1992, this is what the stress picture looked like. Now, this paper was published in 1997. And what the authors said in this paper is they said that the next place to have an earthquake will be this area here, will be the Izmit region. We don't know when it's going to be. We can't predict it, but we can say with some amount of confidence that this will be the location of the next earthquake. And if any of you know your earthquake history, in 1999, so 2 years after this paper was published, there was indeed a large earthquake in Izmit. Okay, so can we do this in central Italy? Could we have those 2016 earthquakes that I've already talked to you about? Is there any chance we could have forecasted them? And so what my research does or has been doing is looking at those historical earthquakes, combining that with the field data and combining it with the Coulomb stress modeling. And I can make models of how the stress has increased on these faults over the last 700 years or so. And so I can produce pictures like this. And now this picture I actually did create before the 2016 earthquake. So what you're looking at here is this is a kind of bird's eye view of all the faults in central Italy, where the green lines are where they can be seen at the surface. And the colors are the faults below the surface. And remember, red is where it's more likely to have earthquakes, and blue is where it's less likely to have earthquakes. And the two faults that moved in 2016 are these two here. And you can see that both of these faults have got some red on them. So they've got some positive stress, and they've got some potential for earthquakes. But most of the faults in Italy have got positive stress. So there is no way that I could have, I said I created this before the 2016 earthquakes. And when they happened, there was I did have a little bit of kind of, I'd wondered if I'd looked at this in more detail before the earthquakes. Is there any way that I could have pinpointed and said, these two earthquakes are going to be the next, sorry, these two faults are going to be the next ones to have an earthquake? And the reality is that no, there is no way I could have done that, because just so many of these faults have got positive stress on them, have got red areas. So it's still a really open question, and one I'm still working on, of why did these two faults move in 2016? Why was it not any of the other ones? And I'm afraid I don't have a good answer for that yet, but maybe give me a few more years of research and maybe I'll be able to answer that. And the last point I just want to finish on is that it's often kind of assumed that if you have a bigger earthquake, it means that there's going to be more deaths. And that's just not the case. And this 2016 earthquake sequence in central Italy really nicely shows this. So this is the fault scarp that moved in both earthquakes. And you can see that there's three different colors on this fault. So you've got the gray up here at the top. You've got then a band of white through here, and a band of kind of brown rock below. So that little white stripe, which is about 10 centimeters high, that's how much the rock moved on the 24th of August, which was a magnitude 6 earthquake, and nearly 300 people lost their lives. The brown stripe is from where the fault moved again on the 30th of October, which was a magnitude 6.5. So that's a 6 to a 6.5. That's about a 6.5 is about 15 times bigger in terms of energy than a 6.0. And in this earthquake, the one in October, there were 0 deaths. So even though it was a bigger earthquake, nobody died. And there are lots of different reasons for that. And some of it is because people were evacuated from the region, but those that weren't evacuated weren't living in their homes. And so they were living in tents. And it's much safer to be in an earthquake, because if a tent falls on your head, it's much, much less likely to kill you than if a building falls on your head. And so there's often a saying within kind of earthquake studies that it's not earthquakes that kill people, it's buildings do. And this illustrates that point quite well, that it's not just the size of the earthquake, there's lots of other factors that go into how badly damaging earthquakes are. And on that point, I'm going to leave it there. So thank you very much for listening. And if there are any questions, I'm very happy to answer them.
Thank you so much. It was a fascinating talk. Really, really enjoyed that. As Zoe said, if you have any questions, if you could just type it into the chat box, please, that would be fantastic. I have one to start off with while people are trying to think of. The regularity of earthquakes now compared to sort of like 700 years ago. Are we having more earthquakes, less earthquakes, or is it round about the same?
Do you mean kind of globally? Because we hear we hear more about it. Yeah. So I don't think they're happening more regularly. I think that we live in a much, much more connected world now. You know, you can only go on, if you go on Twitter, for example, because I follow a lot of people that work in earthquakes in different countries around the world on Twitter, and I almost hear about earthquakes before they turn up in BBC News or The Guardian or any commercial, normal news channels, because it's just so easy to get information. Whereas, hundreds of years ago, if there'd been a minor earthquake in Japan or China or New Zealand, it probably wouldn't have made the British news, because it probably wouldn't have been that interesting. So no, I think it's more that we're hearing more about it rather than them actually getting more frequent.
Thank you for that. Good morning, Vincent. Vincent is asking, why is Central Italy so tectonically active?
Oh, that's a good question. So it's very, very close to a boundary between two major tectonic plates. And because ultimately the main driver for all earthquakes is plate tectonics. And this is the idea that, you know, the surface of the earth is broken up into like jigsaw pieces that move around relative to each other. And as they move past each other, that's what generates earthquakes. So we've got Europe sits on, most of Europe sits on one tectonic plate. And then you've got most of the continent of Africa sits on another tectonic plate. And it's where those two meet, which is in the Mediterranean Sea, which is where we get the most tectonically active areas in Europe. So Italy, Greece, Turkey, Cyprus, a bit in Spain, all of those areas are because there's a plate boundary that goes through the Mediterranean.
Thank you. We've got a question from Mike on Facebook. Will the increase in tectonic activity in Italy increase volcanic activity?
Ooh, that's a good question. So most of the volcanoes in central Italy, in Italy, are not directly in the region that I studied. So they're a little bit further. They are a bit further south. I mean, you've got Vesuvius, which is in Naples. And then obviously Etna, which is down in Sicily. There are some people that have looked at the relationship between earthquakes and volcanoes in central Italy. And I can't precisely remember, but I think that there might have been a bit of a correlation, but it's one of these things that we don't have, you know, even with volcanic eruptions in Italy, we don't have that many observations. So you can maybe observe 2 earthquakes and 2 volcanoes erupting at the same, you know, happening at the same time, but that's not really enough data to then say for definite, yes, every time there's an earthquake, there's going to be a volcanic eruption. We would need a lot more data to be able to say that with any kind of certainty.
Thanks for that, Mike. If there's any other questions, if you could quickly ask them now. Just to remind you of the rest of the day. At 10 a.m. we have Thomas Clements on how do squishy animals turn into fossils. 11 a.m. we have Vincent with the geological structural evolution of the Jurassic Coast World Heritage Site. 1 p.m. the future of the Jurassic Coast collection with Chris Reedman. 3 p.m. Spirals in Time, what can ammonites teach us about the life in ancient oceans with James Witts. And at 6 p.m. Dinosaurs, the new visions of a lost world with Michael Benton. Doesn't look like there's any other further questions, Zoe, but thank you so much for today. I know you've taken some time out of your holiday to join us, so I really do appreciate it. But
love a bit of weekend science. No, thank you very much for asking me to talk.
Okay, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your week.
I've just spotted a question.
Oh,
Someone's asked how many fault lines are there in the UK? Ooh, it's a bit of a how long is a piece of string question. In terms of active fault lines, which is probably the one that you probably want to know about because they're the ones that cause earthquakes, we don't have any faults in the UK that are classed as active because, normally to class a fault as being active, it has to have moved in the last kind of few tens of thousands of years. So we don't have any active faults in the UK by that definition. However, there are lots of fault lines in the UK, you know, hundreds, probably even thousands, depending on exactly how you count them. And the reason for that is that the UK is geologically a bit of a real jigsaw puzzle. So was made up of lots of different continents in the past colliding together. And when you get continents colliding, that's when you get faults being made. So, for example, the Great Glen Fault in Scotland is a major fault structure. You know, it's got what goes through from Inverness to Fort William, where you get all the locks along that fault. Now that hasn't moved for hundreds of millions of years. So it's not an active fault, but it is a fault. And there's lots of them in the UK. And as a geologist, you know, we can go out and kind of read them in the landscape. But in terms of active faults, no, we don't have any in the UK.
That's brilliant. Thank you again, Zoe. If there's no other questions, I think that's it. Again, thank you, Zoe, and have a wonderful weekend. And
thank you.
I really appreciate your time.
Enjoy the rest of the talks for today and tomorrow.
Thank you very much.